The morning Wren Calloway turned 18, her foster mother slid a manila envelope across the kitchen table without looking up from her coffee. "Sign at the bottom," Linda said. "Both pages." Wren signed. She didn't read the pages first. She'd learned a long time ago that the documents adults put in front of you were never about what you wanted. They were about what the system needed to move on to the next thing. She pressed the pen down hard and wrote her name in the same careful letters she'd been practicing since second grade, back when a teacher told her that a person's signature was the one thing nobody could take from them. That teacher had meant it kindly. Wren had taken it practically. She'd been practicing her signature ever since, making it clear and unhurried, the kind of signature that looked like it belonged to someone who knew exactly who she was. Linda checked both signatures, tapped the pages against the table to straighten them, and slid them into a manila folder already sitting on the counter. The folder went into a drawer. The drawer closed. "You've got until 5, Linda said. "I need the room for the next placement." That was it. No cake on the counter. No card propped against the sugar bowl. No pretending this was anything other than what it was, a transaction that had reached its expiration date. Wren had been in this house for 2 years and 4 months, and Linda had never once asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. She'd asked about homework, she'd asked about curfews, she'd asked whether the form from the school nurse had been signed. Those were the questions Linda asked, because those were the questions the system required answers to. The larger questions, the ones that mattered, the ones that kept a person up at night, those Linda left alone, and over time, Wren had learned to leave them alone too. Wren pushed back from the table and went upstairs. Her room was the smallest one on the second floor, the one with the window that looked out over the neighbor's chain-link fence and a strip of dead grass beyond it. She'd never put anything on the walls. She'd learned early that decorating a room was a kind of optimism that foster care had a way of punishing. You put something up, and 3 weeks later you were in a different house where the walls were a different color, and you'd left something of yourself behind in a place that had already forgotten you were there. So she'd stopped putting things up. The twin bed had a mattress that sagged in the middle. The dresser had a drawer that stuck. She'd lived here for over 2 years, and the room looked the same as the day she arrived, as if she'd never been in it at all. That had been intentional once. Now it just felt like the only way she knew how to live. Everything she owned fit in a black garbage bag. 3 changes of clothes folded the way Earl had taught her, flat and tight, so they didn't wrinkle and took up the least possible space. 1 pair of jeans with a small tear at the knee that she'd sewn, shut herself with a needle she bought from a drugstore, the stitching close and even the kind of repair that would outlast the denim around it. A pair of boots with the soles wearing through on the left heel, the right one still solid, as if the right foot had been more careful about where it walked. A toothbrush, a bar of soap still in its wrapper, a library book she'd already returned but somehow still felt guilty about, the guilt of a person who had been careful with borrowed things for so long that the habit had attached itself even to things that were no longer borrowed. And around her neck, the thing she never took off, a small brass locket on a thin chain, worn smooth from 18 years of handling. The brass had the particular warmth of something that had been close to skin for a very long time, that had absorbed the body heat of its wearer until the metal itself seemed to hold it even when removed. Earl had given her the locket the day he picked her up. She was 4 years old and she didn't understand what was happening, only that a tall man with rough hands and a kind voice put a chain around her neck and said, "This is so you always have something of mine with you." She remembered the weight of it when he first fastened it, heavier than she expected, real in a way that the moment itself hadn't yet felt real. She touched it with both hands and looked down at it, and then looked up at him, and he'd smiled the way he smiled when something mattered to him, but he wasn't going to make a production of it. There was no photo inside the locket. There never had been. She'd opened it 1,000 times over the years, always hoping to find something that hadn't been there before, and it was always just the empty brass interior, slightly tarnished, smelling faintly of nothing. She'd stopped being surprised by the emptiness. She'd started thinking of it as the locket's nature, a container that held potential rather than content, a small brass promise of something that might someday be filled. She slung the garbage bag over her shoulder and went downstairs. Linda was already on the phone in the kitchen talking to someone about a pickup time and an intake form. She didn't look up when Wren passed the doorway. She didn't say goodbye, didn't pause mid-sentence, didn't even shift her weight. Wren walked out the front door and pulled it shut behind her, and the latch clicked with a particular sound of a latch that has been opened and closed so many thousands of times that it no longer requires any conscious effort from the person doing it. And that chapter of her life was over. The walk to the bus stop took 15 minutes. She'd made that walk hundreds of times in every season, in rain and snow, and the thick, humid August heat that settled over Dayton like a wet cloth pressed against the skin. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every uneven square of concrete, every spot where the tree roots had pushed up from below and made a ridge that caught you if you weren't paying attention. But this time was different, and she noticed things she'd stopped seeing years ago. The way you notice a room when you're leaving it for the last time, and suddenly its details have the quality of things being memorized rather than simply observed. The fire hydrant on the corner that the Garza kid had spray-painted blue on a dare last summer. The crack in the sidewalk at the intersection of Maple and Fifth that she used to jump over on the way to school, the way kids do when they've decided that stepping on a crack actually means something and they're not willing to risk being wrong. The barbershop with the rotating pole that only worked on Tuesdays. The diner where the window booth was always occupied by the same two old men drinking coffee and arguing about things that didn't matter to anyone else. Sports scores mostly, and the right way to fix a particular model of truck engine, and who had been responsible for what went wrong with some local road project 15 years ago. Wren had walked past them every school day for 6 years, and she'd never learned their names, and now she never would. 6 years in this neighborhood, and she was already a ghost moving through it. Nobody on the street looked up as she passed. A woman walking a dog glanced at the garbage bag for half a second, made the quick calculation that people always made when they saw a young person with a garbage bag. The assessment of circumstances, the decision not to ask, and looked away. A man hosing down his driveway watched the water pool in the cracks without lifting his eyes. Wren was used to it. She had been invisible for a long time. When you moved through enough places without leaving a mark, you started to understand that invisibility wasn't something done to you. It was something you learned to carry, like the garbage bag, like the boots with the worn heel, just another thing you got used to, one more weight that stopped feeling like weight because it had always been there. At the bus stop, she sat on the metal bench and set the bag between her feet. An old man waiting for the same bus glanced at the bag, then at her face, then down at the sidewalk. His expression passed through the same sequence she'd seen hundreds of times on hundreds of faces: recognition, consideration, retreat. Wren watched a pigeon work at something on the ground near the storm drain with the focused, patient determination of a creature that has never once doubted that what it's doing is worthwhile. The sky was the flat, white color it got in October before the clouds decided what they wanted to do, the kind of sky that holds all its options open. She had $41 in her pocket. She had a bus pass that expired in 3 weeks. And she had a letter. The letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, forwarded from the county office to Linda's address, with a sticky note from someone named Kay Marsh at the Department of Children's Services. The sticky note said only forwarding per protocol. The letter itself was from the Dayton County Probate Office. One paragraph on county letterhead, the font slightly uneven in the way of documents produced on aging office equipment by people who have been producing the same documents for so long that they no longer think about the words they contain. It said that one item from the estate of Earl James Calloway remained unclaimed at a storage facility on Route 40. Unit 7, a 1994 Bluebird school bus converted. Contact information for the facility was listed at the bottom with the name Harmon Storage and a phone number with a 740 area code. One item, her grandfather's entire life reduced to a single sentence on county letterhead. She'd read it 3 times when it arrived and then folded it back into its envelope and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, the one with the zipper that actually worked. She'd read it again that night and the night after. She knew it by heart now, could have reproduced it word for word, but she read it again on the metal bench at the bus stop because sometimes you needed to keep reading something true in order to keep believing it was real. The crosstown bus arrived 4 minutes late, which was better than usual. Wren got on, swiped her pass, and took a seat in the back. She set the garbage bag on the seat beside her and held the letter in both hands. She read it 3 times the way she always read important things once, for the facts once, for what wasn't said, and once just to be sure she hadn't misread anything the first 2 times. One item, a bus, Unit 7 on Route 40. Outside the window, the city moved past in the way cities do when you're heading toward the edges, the neighborhood's getting a little looser, the lots getting a little wider. More gaps between buildings where things used to stand and had been cleared away without anything taking their place. Strip malls with half the storefronts dark, the glass covered in paper or plywood. A check cashing place next to a laundromat next to a dollar store. The 3 of them in a row like a summary of a particular kind of financial situation. A church on a corner with a hand-lettered sign that read, "All are welcome," in letters that had faded from black to gray, the welcome still there but slightly harder to read. A salvage yard with a chain-link perimeter and towers of crushed metal visible above the fence line, the compressed remains of things that had been useful once and were waiting to be useful again in a different form. Wren looked at the church sign for a moment as the bus rolled past. She thought about the word welcome. She thought about what it meant to be welcome somewhere, and how rare it was to feel it, and how different it was from simply being tolerated, which was most of what she'd experienced in the past 6 years. Foster homes had rules. The rules were about meals and curfews and homework and noise levels after 9. Nobody had rules about belonging. That was too complicated to legislate, too subjective to enforce, too dependent on something that couldn't be put on a form. So everyone just left it alone, and you learned to eat at the table and sleep in the room and not expect more than what was offered. And after a while, you stopped noticing the difference between being somewhere and belonging there, the way you stopped noticing a sound that's always present. Earl had been different. She tried not to think about Earl too often because the thinking led to the feeling, and the feeling led somewhere she couldn't always find her way back from. But sitting in the back of the crosstown bus with a garbage bag and $41 and a letter about a bus on Route 40, she let herself think about him for a few minutes. The way you allow yourself something you've been denying yourself because the circumstances have finally made denial seem beside the point. He was tall. That was the first thing she remembered. The tallness of him, the way he seemed to fill a doorway without trying. The way his presence in a room changed. The room's proportions slightly made it feel occupied in a different way than it had before he walked in. Big hands with the knuckles enlarged from decades of work, the kind of hands that looked like they were designed for a purpose and had been fulfilling it their whole lives. A face that had been in the sun for decades, the lines of it deep and comfortable, the way wood grain is comfortable, nothing sharp or unexpected about it. Everything settled into its final form and at peace with what that form was. He smelled like motor oil and coffee and something she could never name that was just Earl, the way some people have a smell that isn't a product or a food, but just themselves, the particular chemistry of a person who has been in the world long enough to develop one. He'd raised her on a school bus, a converted bluebird that he'd gutted himself and rebuilt into something livable. A narrow bed along one wall, a fold-down table bolted to the floor cabinets he'd made from scrap lumber and finished smooth by hand so she wouldn't get splinters. He drove from one small town to the next, stopping wherever someone needed something fixed. Furnaces, trucks, fences, roofs, engines, gutters, well pumps, septic systems, screen doors. Back porch steps, Earl Calloway could fix almost anything, and he charged for almost none of it. He had a way of figuring out what something was worth and then charging about half of that, and even that he'd sometimes waive if the person looked like they couldn't afford it, which meant he waived it more often than he probably should have, which meant they were always running lean, which never seemed to concern him. She was 12 when everything changed. She remembered that day in pieces, the way you remember things that are too large to fit inside a single memory. The county services office with its fluorescent lights and its carpet the color of old oatmeal, the kind of carpet that had probably been chosen because it was the most inoffensive possible color, which turned out to be no color at all. The social worker with the kind voice who kept using words like transition and arrangement and temporary, words that were meant to soften things but had the opposite effect because you could hear the effort behind them. The ambulance outside in the parking lot, its back doors open. Earl sitting on the edge of the cot inside, looking confused and frightened in a way she'd never seen on his face before. Like a man who had opened a door expecting one thing and found something completely different on the other side. Not a bad thing exactly, but a wrong thing. Something that didn't match any of the rooms in the house of his understanding. She remembered the look on his face when he saw her through the gap in the ambulance doors. How it changed. How the confusion cleared for just a moment, and the Earl she knew was there again. The one with the steady eyes, and the hands that knew how to fix things, and the voice that never rushed anything. He reached toward her through the opening. "I'll come back for you, Bird." That was the last clear thing he ever said to her. The social worker had stepped between them, then gently, firmly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows that quickly is kinder than slowly. The ambulance doors closed. Wren stood in the parking lot with a social worker's hand on her shoulder and watched the ambulance pull away, and the sun was doing something complicated with the clouds that made everything look slightly overexposed. And that was the last time she ever saw Earl Calloway standing upright and whole in himself. She hadn't been told when he died. That was the thing she'd never been able to square, never been able to fit into any understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Not the death itself, because death was something you could eventually accept, something that had a logic to it, even when the timing was wrong, but the silence around it. Earl passed 14 months after going into the memory care facility, and nobody called her. She found out 3 months later, from a letter that had been forwarded twice before reaching her current placement, a form letter from the county noting the closure of the estate and the availability of unclaimed property. She'd read it standing in the hallway of a house she'd been in for 6 weeks, still wearing her coat from school, her backpack on one shoulder, the day's homework still inside it. And she'd stood there long enough that the hallway light timed out, and she was standing in the dark with a letter about the closure of her grandfather's estate and no one to call. The bus stopped at the far end of the line near an intersection marked by a tire shop on one corner and a pawn shop on the other. Route 40 ran east from there, a 2-lane road that headed out toward the parts of the county that hadn't been developed enough to have a Walgreens yet. The sky was still doing its indeterminate October thing, holding options open. She walked. The storage facility was a half-mile from the bus stop, set back from the road behind a chain-link fence, topped with a coil of razor wire that had rusted to an orange-brown over what must have been many years of Ohio winters. The sign was painted wood, not a lit sign, just paint that said Harmon Storage in letters that were still legible if you knew what you were reading. A handwritten note taped to the office door said, "Back in 10 minutes," in blue ballpoint pen. The handwriting, the unhurried script of someone who doesn't worry much about being taken at their word. Wren sat on the concrete step and waited. After 20 minutes, a woman came around the side of the building carrying 2 bags of mulch, one over each shoulder, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had been doing physical work all her life and had long since stopped trying to make it look easy or effortless or anything other than what it was. She was somewhere in her early 60s, heavy-set, with short silver hair cut close to her head and a face that had been outdoors in all kinds of weather, without any particular protection against what weather does to a face over time. She dropped the bags next to a stack of others near the fence and dusted her hands on her jeans with the efficiency of someone who has dusted their hands on their jeans 100,000 times. She looked at Wren on the step. She looked at the garbage bag. She looked at the boots with the worn heel. She looked at the locket. The whole assessment took about 4 seconds and covered more ground than most people's assessments covered in 4 minutes. "Help you," she said. "I'm here about Unit 7, Wren said. "The bus." The woman was quiet for a moment. She studied Wren's face with the focused attention of someone checking a reference against a memory they'd been carrying for a long time. Whatever she found there seemed to answer something for her to close a loop that had been open for years. "You're Earl's girl," she said. It wasn't a question. "His granddaughter," Wren said. The woman wiped her hands on her jeans again and came forward, hand extended. "Dottie Harmon, I run this place." Her grip was firm and dry and calloused in the particular way of someone who worked with their hands every day, not for show, but because there was always work that needed doing, and hands were how you did it. Wren Calloway. Got a letter from probate, Wren said. Says the bus is mine if I want it. Been yours for 6 years, Dottie said. Come on. She led Wren through the lot without further explanation, the way people lead you through a place they know thoroughly and assume you'll keep up. Past rows of orange garage-style doors, padlocked shut, the locks varying in age and quality in a way that suggested different owners with different levels of concern about what they were storing. Past 2 shipping containers side by side with weeds growing in the gravel between them. Past a trailer with its hitch resting in the dirt. The lot was larger than it looked from the road extending back further than the fence line suggested, the way some places contain more than their exteriors promise. Unit 7 was in the far rear corner under a corrugated metal awning that extended from the back fence and provided shade that no one had needed in some time. The bus sat in a way that old things sit when they've been still for a long time settled. The tires flattened and the frame dropped slightly, as though the ground had slowly been reaching up for it, claiming it inch by inch over 6 years of seasons. The yellow had faded to the color of old cream, the kind of yellow that used to be bright and then spent years becoming something else, something quieter. Weeds had grown up around the tires and then died back and grown again through multiple seasons, leaving a thatch of dry stems packed into the gravel. The windshield had a crack along the lower corner that Wren didn't remember being there before. But the structure was intact. She could see that immediately, not just as something she observed, but as something she felt the recognition of a practiced eye that had learned to read structures the way other people read faces. The frame, the body panels, the roof, all of it still in place. Nothing caved in, nothing rusted through the bones of the thing still holding its shape against everything the years had done to its surface. She stood in front of it and said nothing. Your grandfather parked it here the day they came for you, Dottie said. Drove it in himself, handed me the key, said he'd be back for it. She paused for a moment. That was the last time I saw him standing up straight. Wren kept her eyes on the bus. How much does he owe? She asked. Nothing. 6 years of storage fees isn't nothing. $60 a month, Dottie said. I covered it. Wren turned to look at her. Why? Dottie reached into her jacket pocket and produced a key. Small brass worn to a satin finish from years of handling the surface of something that had been held and rubbed and thought about many times. She held it out between 2 fingers. Earl fixed my furnace, my water heater, and the back porch steps. Never charged me what the work was worth. Not once. She paused. I figured I owed him more than he owed me. Wren took the key. It was warm from Dottie's pocket. Take your time, Dottie said, and walked back toward the front of the lot without saying anything else, which was the right thing to do. The door opened with a groan that Wren recognized without knowing she'd stored the memory a specific metallic complaint from a specific hinge. The bottom one on the driver's side that Earl had been meaning to spray with WD-40 for as long as she could remember, and never got around to because there was always something more urgent. The familiarity of the sound moved through her before she had time to think about it the way the body recognizes things the mind hasn't caught up to yet. She stood at the bottom of the 3 entry steps and breathed in. The smell hit her before anything else, before any of the visual details had a chance to register. Vinyl, motor oil. Something underneath both of those that wasn't a product or a substance, but a presence. The accumulated residue of a particular life lived in a particular space over many years. The way certain rooms hold the essence of the people who have spent time in them. She would not have been able to describe it to anyone who hadn't been inside that bus before. But she knew it immediately and completely, the way you know a piece of music you heard as a child before you even know the name of it. Recognized in the body before the mind catches up. Understood at a level that precedes language. She climbed the steps and stood in the aisle. Earl had gutted the bus when she was a baby, ripped out the standard seating, and rebuilt the interior over several months while she slept in a playpen, borrowed from a neighbor 3 towns over in a town whose name she'd never been told. She'd grown up hearing the story of those months, the weekends of cutting and measuring and sanding, the trips to salvage yards and lumber yards. The slow transformation of a school bus interior into something that could hold a life and keep it comfortable and make it feel, if not permanent, then at least sustain. She hadn't been old enough to witness any of it, but she'd grown up inside the result of it, and she knew every inch of it the way you know the layout of the first space you were ever completely comfortable in. The narrow bed along the left wall, its frame bolted to the floor, and wall both the bolts recessed so they didn't catch on anything. Still there, the mattress still on it, dusty but intact. The fold-down table hinged and bolted to a support that Earl had designed himself, the surface worn smooth at the corners from years of meals and homework and card games. Still there, the cabinets Earl had built from scrap lumber, pine mostly, with cedar in a couple of places where he'd found pieces the right size at a salvage yard in Kentucky. Still there, still solid, their doors hanging straight, because Earl had always hung a door straight, always taken the time to get the alignment right before drilling the pilot holes. She ran her hand along the front of the cabinet doors, every surface sanded smooth by hand. She remembered being told about that Earl had done it because she was a toddler, and he was worried about splinters, that he'd spent 2 full weekends just sanding, running his palm over every surface until there was nothing left that could catch. He'd measured risk the way he measured everything, thoroughly and without rushing. The flannel curtains were still in the windows. Dark blue plaid, faded now to a blue-gray stiff from years of dust and disuse. She'd helped him make those curtains. She was 6 or 7, sitting at the fold-down table with a piece of chalk marking where the hem should go, while Earl pinned and cut and ran the battered sewing machine they'd bought from an estate sale in a town she'd long forgotten. She touched the edge of one panel, and it felt fragile, like something that needed to be handled carefully, a texture at the boundary between intact and gone. On the door frame at the top of the entry steps, she found the pencil marks. He'd measured her height on every birthday. Always the same procedure, the same words, each time delivered with the same solemnity, as if it were a ritual that required exactly this form and no other. Take off your shoes, stand straight, don't lift your heels. A horizontal line in pencil, the date written small beside it, and her age in a circle. They went up the door frame in a column, starting low and climbing. Age 5, age 6, age 7. Age 8, she remembered that one, remembered standing against the frame, and him looking down at her with that expression he got when something was funny, but he wasn't going to show it, the suppressed amusement that was one of his most recognizable expressions. Age 9. Age 10. Age 11 was the last one. She stood for a long time with her finger on that mark. The last one, 4 feet 8 inches. The year he started repeating himself. The year she started noticing that he'd ask her what she wanted for breakfast, she'd tell him, and 20 minutes later he'd ask again, not with any awareness that he'd asked before, just the same question, fresh and genuine. The year she started watching his face for something she didn't have a word for, yet a quality of wrongness, like a picture hung slightly crooked that you couldn't stop seeing once you'd noticed it, that you couldn't unsee no matter how much easier it would have been not to. She hadn't said anything to anyone. She hadn't known who to tell, or whether telling would help or make things worse, or whether there was anything to be done that wasn't already being done by living with it carefully. She'd just been careful. She'd reminded him of things without making it obvious she was reminding him. She'd started keeping track of where he left his keys. She'd gotten good at redirecting conversations that had started looping back on themselves, steering them gently toward a different channel before he noticed they'd been redirected. She was 11 years old, and she'd become a caretaker without anyone asking her to, because the alternative was not doing it, and she'd never been able to choose not to do something that needed doing. She went to the driver's seat. The vinyl was split along the seam, the foam underneath showing through in a long crack. The leather wrap on the steering wheel was peeling in long strips, the bare metal of the wheel showing underneath. She sat down carefully, and it creaked under her, the same creak from the same place, the spring in the seat frame that Earl had always been meaning to fix and never did, because they'd both gotten used to it. Because some sounds become part of the texture of a place, and you stop hearing them as problems and start hearing them as features. She put her hands on the wheel. Through the dusty windshield, she could see the back fence of the lot and the corrugated metal awning, and Dottie standing near the office trailer with her arms folded, looking in a direction that wasn't toward the bus, giving Wren the privacy of her own sightline. The sky above the fence was flat and white. She sat there for a while with her hands on the wheel and didn't try to think about anything in particular. Sometimes you needed to let a moment be what it was without naming it or analyzing it or deciding what it meant. Earl had taught her that, though not in words. He taught it by example, the way he could sit with a broken thing without immediately reaching for a tool, taking a minute first to understand what he was dealing with, to let the problem show him what it needed rather than imposing his first idea about how to fix it. She was dealing with an absence that had the weight and shape of a presence. She let herself feel it. Then she turned around. The seat directly behind the driver's position had always been different from the rest. When Earl gutted the bus, he'd kept this one seat a standard school bus seat, the kind with the padded back and the metal frame, and bolted it down, himself positioned just behind and to the right of the driver's station. He'd told her it was structural, that it braced a support beam. He'd always said that with a kind of finality that closed off further questioning, which she understood now at 18, as a thing adults did when they had a reason they weren't going to explain and had decided that the explanation would cause more problems than the mystery. She crouched beside the seat. The vinyl was worse here than anywhere else in the bus, cracked all the way through in several places. The foam inside compressed and dry and pulling away from the frame. Through the widest split, she could see the metal frame underneath. And she could see something else. An edge of green, a dark matte green that wasn't part of the seat frame. A right angle, a surface that was deliberately shaped, manufactured. Intentional, not a structural component, but a thing placed there by someone who knew what they were doing and why. She worked her fingers under the vinyl along the crack and pulled. The material came away in strips, brittle and dry, the way vinyl gets when it's been under stress for a long time, and the adhesive has long since given up whatever held it. She peeled it back section by section, careful not to rush, until the shape beneath was fully visible. Bolted to the underside of the seat frame with 4 half-inch bolts, set with the same care as everything else Earl had ever bolted to anything, was a metal box. Dark green, roughly the size of a shoebox. Military-style construction, the kind of box that was built to survive conditions that would destroy an ordinary container, built for things that mattered in environments that didn't care whether they mattered. The latch had rusted shut, a solid bar of orange corrosion across the gap. She went to the cabinet where Earl kept his hand tools. The cabinet opened with the same slight resistance it always had, the wood having expanded and contracted through too many seasons, leaving the fit slightly tighter than originally intended. Inside, on the left side of the second shelf, exactly where it always was, a flathead screwdriver. A craftsman red handle, the blade worn but still sharp, still useful. Earl had never owned a tool he couldn't use. It took her several minutes to work the latch. She didn't force it. Earl had taught her that forcing a rusted mechanism often damaged whatever was inside as thoroughly as it freed it, and that the extra 10 minutes of patience usually saved you an hour of consequences. She worked the screwdriver into the latch gap and applied steady sideways pressure, rocking it gradually, feeling it give in small increments, each one slightly larger than the last. When it finally released, it released with a sudden ease that made her catch her breath. The lid was stiff. She worked it up from the sides, alternating pressure, and it opened. Inside, wrapped in olive drab oilcloth, folded carefully at all 4 edges, with the precision of someone who understood that packaging was part of preservation, were 4 things. She unwrapped the oilcloth without hurrying. A leather journal. The cover cracked and soft with age, the edges worn through to fiber at the corners. A rubber band held it closed, the rubber gone brittle and slightly sticky. A bank book from First Federal Savings. A rubber band around this one, too. A folded piece of paper with a county seal visible through the fold, the embossed stamp of official record, and a white envelope sealed. On the front, in Earl's handwriting, she would have known it anywhere, that small, careful script, the letters pressed firmly into the page, as if he wanted to make sure they stayed there, as if he was aware that paper was fragile and words needed to be committed to it with appropriate force. 2 words. For Wren. She sat back on her heels on the grimy floor of the bus and held the 4 items in her lap and looked at them. She picked up the bank book. The entries were in Earl's hand. Deposits, all of them, no withdrawals. $50, 75, 100, 20. The dates went back 18 years. The amounts were modest, the kind that came from careful living, and the conscious decision to put something away every time there was something to put away, even when what there was to put away was small. She turned through the pages slowly, reading the dates, reading the amounts, doing rough arithmetic in her head. The way she'd always done arithmetic in her head because it was faster, and she'd always preferred the faster way. The final balance read $23,411. The account was in her name, Renan Calloway. She read the balance again. She turned to the first page and confirmed the account name. She turned to the last entry and confirmed the balance. The numbers were the same both times, and the time after that. Her hands were not steady. She noticed this without judgment, the way you notice a fact about a situation relevant, worth knowing, not something to be ashamed of. She set the bank book down and unfolded the piece of paper with the county seal. It was a property deed. A 1/4-acre lot in a town called Millhaven, 4 hours south, in a county she'd never heard of, the kind of county that existed between the larger places and didn't get mentioned much. Legal description: lot number A, recording date from 12 years ago. She'd been 6 years old 12 years ago. She'd been riding on Earl's shoulders in whatever small town they'd stopped in that week, learning the names of engine parts, eating scrambled eggs off the 2-burner propane stove, falling asleep to the sound of the highway through the windows. The deed was in her name. Both documents, the bank account and the deed, were in her name. Her full name, complete, correct, Renan Calloway, as if whoever had drawn them up had been given very clear and specific instructions about exactly how the name was to appear. She sat on the floor of the bus with the documents in her hands and tried to understand the shape of what she was holding. A bank account he'd started before she could tie her shoes. A piece of land he'd purchased when she was small enough to ride on his shoulders. Both in her name, both waiting for her. She looked at the journal. She looked at the envelope with her name on it. She opened the journal first. The first page was dated 12 years ago. Earl's handwriting, small and careful, the way he wrote when something mattered, the letters more deliberate than his everyday script. She read the first paragraph twice. Bought the lot today. 1/4 acre on the south end of Millhaven, up against the tree line. There's a creek at the back. Carol would have loved it. She stopped. She read that sentence again. Carol would have loved it. She turned the page. She read a few lines of the next entry, which was about soil conditions and drainage and the cost of lumber, and then she skipped forward. She was looking for Carol. She didn't know exactly why. She didn't know anyone named Carol. Earl had almost never talked about her mother. When Wren asked, he'd go quiet in that particular way he had, the way a door closes, not because it's being slammed, but because someone has decided gently and finally that the conversation is over and they're not going to be moved on the question of whether it's actually over. Everything she'd been told about her mother had come from one source: Garrett Calloway, Earl's nephew, the only other family. Garrett had told her the story in a parking lot when she was 12. While Earl sat frightened and confused in the back of an ambulance, Garrett had pulled Wren aside with the businesslike manner of someone delivering information. They'd prepared to deliver information they decided was necessary and decided to get over with. Your mother left when you were a baby. She just walked out. Earl took you because nobody else would. He'd said it without cruelty, but also without any particular softness. The way you say a fact that you've decided requires no elaboration, no context, no gentleness. She'd carried that for 6 years. Her mother had left. Her mother had chosen to go. She'd looked at a baby and decided there was something else she wanted more, somewhere else she needed to be. That story had shaped things, not dramatically, not in a way she could point to and say this is where it happened, but quietly, the way groundwater shapes limestone, invisibly and over a long time. She skipped forward in the journal to an entry about 20 pages in. The handwriting here was the same steady, deliberate Earl at his most careful, but she could hear the weight behind it in the way the pen had pressed harder on some words than others. Drove through the town with the church where Carol used to sing in the choir. Wren was asleep in the back. I almost woke her up to show her, but I didn't. What would I say? This is where your mother used to sing before she died. The girl doesn't even know she's dead. Wren read that sentence until she was certain she hadn't misread it. The girl doesn't even know she's dead. The bus was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the storage lot, a metal door rattled on its track. A car passed on Route 40. A bird crossed the white sky above the windshield and was gone. She sat on the dirty floor with the journal in her hands and felt something shift in the architecture of the story she'd been living inside for 6 years. Not slowly, not gradually. All at once, the way a load-bearing wall gives, you don't see it moving, and then suddenly the room looks different. The proportions have changed. The space means something different than it did before. Her mother hadn't left. Her mother was dead. Earl knew. Earl had always known. He'd known for the entire 6 years she'd spent carrying the weight of a woman who'd apparently looked at her and walked away. He'd known when she'd asked in that careful way she'd learned to ask things, whether she'd ever find her mother someday. He'd sat across from that question and had not answered it with the truth. She understood sitting on the floor of the bus that there were things she wasn't ready to feel yet. She filed them where you file things that are too large to hold right now, in the place that holds them until conditions are different. She closed the journal. She did not open the white envelope. She set it on top of the journal and held both against her chest and breathed. The envelope was the last word, and last words deserve more than a dusty floor in a storage lot in October. She would know what to do with it when the time was right. She gathered everything back into the metal box, set the journal and envelope on top, and carried it down the steps of the bus. She stood for a moment on the gravel outside, letting the October air do what it could, which was cool and clean and smelled of dead leaves and distant exhaust. Dottie was sitting on the step of the office trailer with a thermos of coffee. She looked up when Wren came around the corner of the last row of units. She didn't say anything, just held the thermos in both hands and waited, which was the right thing to do. Wren set the box down on the step beside her. She opened it and waited while Dottie looked. Dottie picked up the bank book. Read the balance. Set it down. Picked up the deed. Read it. Set it down. She looked at the journal but didn't reach for it. That man, she said, and her voice caught somewhere in the middle, and she stopped and didn't try to continue for a moment. He was building me a house, Wren said, in Mill Haven. And you didn't know. I didn't know any of it. Didn't. Dottie was quiet for a moment. She looked at the bank book again, ran her thumb across the balance. You know how long it takes to save that kind of money doing mechanic work, $50 at a time? She set it down and looked at the metal box. That man was putting money away for you before you could read. He never said anything. That was Earl. Dottie unscrewed the cap of the thermos and turned it over in her hands without pouring anything. He never told you what he was doing for you. He just did it. She looked toward the back of the lot, toward the corrugated awning where the bus sat. You know what he said the day he parked that bus here? Wren waited. He said, if my girl comes looking for it, you give her the key. If she doesn't come, don't let them crush it. Dottie looked at Wren directly. 6 years, Wren. He was counting on you showing up. Wren looked at the deed in the box. A 1/4-acre lot. A creek at the back. A town 4 hours south that she'd never heard of. She had $41 in a garbage bag and a room that was no longer hers as of 5 o'clock today. I've never been to Mill Haven, she said. My truck's around back, Dottie said, standing up. I can have you there by dark. Wren looked at her. You don't know me. I knew Earl. Dottie started walking toward the back of the trailer. That's enough. Wren looked back toward the bus one more time. The faded cream yellow paint. The dent above the rear wheel from a mailbox in Kentucky that she'd watched happen at age 8 from the back of the bus, while Earl sighed and climbed out to assess the damage with the resignation of a man who had backed into mailboxes before and expected to back into them again. The stripe of blue tape on the side mirror still there. Still blue, though, dimmer now, faded by years of sun. She put that there at age 7. She thought it made the bus look faster and Earl had let it stay without comment, which was the highest form of approval he offered. She picked up the garbage bag in the metal box. The box held the journal and the bank book and the deed and the envelope she wasn't ready for yet. She carried all of it toward the sound of Dottie's truck engine turning over in the lot behind the trailer. 40 minutes south of the storage facility, the city had given way to the flat farmland that ran through the middle of Ohio like a table that had been cleared of everything except the horizon. The fields were brown and harvested, their surfaces broken by the occasional windbreak of old oaks, or a farmhouse set back from the road with a long gravel drive and a barn behind it that had been there longer than the farmhouse. The afternoon light was low and yellow across everything. The particular angle that October light takes in the late afternoon in this part of the country, when the sun is close to the horizon and the fields catch it and hold it for a moment before it goes. Wren had the journal open in her lap. She kept coming back to the same entries. The lot purchase, the drainage, the first foundation pour, the framing. Earl's handwriting moving across the page in its careful, deliberate way, laying down the record of something he'd done entirely alone and entirely without telling anyone who would have had reason to want to know. She turned a page. Wren's birthday today, 10 years old, made her a cake on the bus stove and it came out flat on one side. She ate 2 pieces and said it was the best cake she'd ever had. Lord, she's got Carol's smile. Exact same one. She sat with that for a long time. The specificity of it. Exact same one. Not an approximation, not a resemblance. The same smile recognized by someone who had known its original. She turned another page and found the entry she'd read on the bus floor, the one that had changed the shape of things. She didn't read it in full again. She didn't need to. She had it by heart now. But seeing it again in the context of the journal, seeing it surrounded by entries about lumber costs and window measurements and weekend drives made it feel different. Not less true, but more situated. More like a fact about a world rather than a verdict about a person. She closed her hand on the page. "Pull over," she said. Dottie glanced at her and eased onto the shoulder without a word. Gravel popped under the tires. The engine idled. Wren held the journal out so Dottie could see the entry she'd marked. Dottie leaned over and read it. Her lips moved slightly on the words that mattered most. She sat back. She looked at the road ahead without seeing it. Then she said, "That's not what Garrett told you." "Garrett told me she left," Wren said, "that she walked out when I was a baby and never came back." She heard her own voice and was slightly surprised by how flat it was. Flat was not what she felt. But flat was what came out the way water comes out level, even when the container holding it is anything but. "He told me she didn't want me." Dottie looked at the journal in Wren's hands. "You believe what's in there." "It's Earl's handwriting," Wren said. "He never lied to me." She paused. "He just didn't tell me everything." Dottie looked at the road for another moment, at the flat farmland extending in both directions at the horizon, holding its position no matter how far you drove toward it. Then she pulled back onto the highway without saying anything more. The truck accelerated back up to speed, and the fields resumed their passage on both sides. Wren closed the journal and held it in her lap with both hands. She looked out the window at the fields going brown in the late afternoon light, and she tried to do what Earl had always done with a broken thing before picking up a tool. She tried to sit with it. She tried to understand the shape of it before deciding what to do. Her mother had not left. Her mother had not chosen something else over her. Her mother had been driving home. They crossed into Ross County as the sun dropped behind the tree line on the western side of the highway, the sky going from pale yellow to a deep orange that lasted about 10 minutes before fading into purple, and then the particular dark blue that precedes full darkness. Dottie drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the window frame, her elbow catching the last warmth of the day. The truck was old, but well-maintained, the engine running with the steady, unhurried rhythm of something that had been properly cared for over many years. Wren recognized that quality in machines the way she recognized it in people. It wasn't about newness or freshness. It was about sustained attention over time. She had the journal open again, but she was moving through it differently now. Not reading from the beginning, not searching for a specific thing, but letting the entries come to her in whatever order the pages offered, giving each one the time it deserved. The construction entries dominated the middle section. Lumber costs and soil conditions, and questions about load-bearing requirements. Weekend drives and the work accomplished and the work remaining. But every so often, between a note about window flashing and an entry about the cost of a septic permit, something else appeared, a glimpse of the other life running alongside the construction, the life that the construction was for. Ren asked me today why we don't have a house like other people. I told her the bus was our house and it just had wheels on it. She thought about that for a minute and then said, "Can we get a house that doesn't move?" I told her I was working on it. She went back to her book. She's reading everything she can get her hands on these days. Library books mostly. She finishes one and I have to find her another one before she gets restless. Carol was the same way. Used to read at the dinner table until her father made a rule about it. Ren read that entry twice. Then she found another one. Finished the framing on the east bedroom today. Ren's room. Put the window opening facing east because she's always been a morning person up before I am sitting at the fold-down table with whatever she's reading while the light comes in. Gets that from Carol. Carol was always up first. Said the morning was the only quiet part of the day and she wasn't going to waste it sleeping through it. She closed her eyes briefly. Opened them. "You keep going back to the same pages," Dottie said, not looking away from the road. "I'm looking for her," Ren said. "My mother." "Finding anything pieces." Ren turned a page. "He wrote about her the way you write about someone you miss. Not like a topic you return to. Like a presence that's supposed to be somewhere and isn't." Dottie didn't respond to that. She understood that some observations didn't require a response, which was one of the things Ren had appreciated about her from the first 10 minutes in the storage lot. There were people who filled silence because silence made them uncomfortable, and there were people who let it stand because they understood that some things needed room to exist without being immediately engaged with. Dottie was the second kind. The state road turned south at a grain elevator, and the road narrowed to 2 lanes with painted shoulders that were more suggestion than fact. The farms on either side were larger here, the fields running further back from the road before hitting the tree lines. Silos visible against the darkening sky. Barns with old advertising painted on their sides faded to near illegibility, the ghosts of products nobody sold anymore. A farm stand closed for the season, its hand-lettered sign still up. Sweet corn, tomatoes, squash, pumpkins. Ren found an entry she'd half seen earlier somewhere in the middle of the journal and stopped. She asked about her mother again today. I didn't answer right. I changed the subject and she let me because she's kind that way, kinder than I deserve. Every time she asks, I tell myself I'll find the right moment, and then the moment passes and I'm further from saying it than I was before. I don't know how to explain to a child that the person she's asking about is gone. I don't know how to put that kind of weight on a face that still laughs at things. So I keep not doing it. And every year it gets heavier and I keep thinking there will be a time when it feels possible, and that time keeps not arriving. She set the journal on her knee and looked out the window. The fields were dark now, visible only as flat shapes against a sky that still held a thin line of dark blue at the western horizon. A farmhouse went by with its windows lit yellow, a shape at the kitchen window that might have been a person. He knew, she said. Every time I asked about her, he knew and he didn't say. Does that change how you feel about him? Dottie asked. Ren considered the question seriously. It deserved serious consideration. No, she said finally. It makes me sad for him, carrying that for that long. She picked up the journal again. He built a house because he couldn't say the words. That's what this is. The whole thing, the house, the money, the deed, all of it. It's what he built in place of what he couldn't say. Dottie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that sounds like Earl. They turned off the state route onto a county road that wound through the low hills south of Chillicothe. The truck's headlights swept across the road ahead, picking out the center line and the gravel shoulders and the occasional reflective post marking a curve. After another 20 minutes, Dottie slowed and checked the property deed against a road sign that read Plum Creek Road. "Should be down here," she said. The road was gravel single lane with passing pull-offs cut into the shoulders every quarter mile or so. Trees closed in on both sides, old oaks and hickories, their crowns meeting overhead to form a tunnel that the headlights illuminated 20 feet at a time, the light finding the road and nothing beyond it. At the end of the road past a mailbox with no name on it and a post that leaned at a 20-degree angle toward the ditch, Dottie stopped the truck. The headlights reached across a cleared area and hit the house, or what was going to be a house. The frame stood at the edge of a field of waist-high grass that had grown up through multiple seasons of no maintenance and become something between a field and a meadow. Four walls of 2x6 studs and headers, their tops open to the sky, the wood gone gray with weathering but still straight, still plumb, the corners still true. Half the roof was done actual shingles dark against the sky solid. The other half was covered in tar paper that had loosened along the edges and was lifting in places where the tacks had pulled through, but the paper itself was still mostly in place. Earl had overlapped it properly and tacked it at close intervals, and 6 years of Ohio weather had tested it without defeating it. The foundation was poured concrete. Even from 30 feet away in truck headlights, Wren could see it was level. No settlement cracks, no heaving. Earl had poured it right, which meant he'd dug it right, which meant he'd spent time on the site before he started reading the ground, the way he read everything patiently without assumptions, letting the thing tell him what it needed. Dottie cut the engine and they sat there. "He got further than I expected," Dottie said. Wren got out of the truck. The grass was wet from an earlier rain and immediately soaked through the canvas of her boots, the cold coming through in that particular way of wet cold that goes directly to the bone without negotiation. She walked toward the house through the tall growth, her hand out ahead of her to feel for anything hidden in the grass, a board, a wire, a root. The evening air smelled like wet soil and creek water. She could hear the creek before she could see it. Running somewhere in the trees behind the lot, a steady low sound that seemed to belong to the place. The way a sound can belong to a place when it has been running there through many seasons. She stepped over a stack of lumber that had been covered with a tarp. The tarp was half rotted, the wood underneath grayed and partly weathered, but when she crouched and pressed her palm against one of the boards, it was still solid. Earl had stacked it properly, elevated off the ground on blocks to keep it out of the standing water protected as well as a tarp in this climate could protect it. She came to the door frame and stopped. No door yet, just the rough opening, the trimmer studs and the header above it, the sill plate below the framing, waiting for whatever came next, with the patience of things that don't know they're waiting. She stepped through and stood inside. 4 rooms just as the journal had described. The floor was plywood subfloor warped in one corner where rain had gotten in through the unfinished section of the roof. The walls were open studs with no insulation or drywall, which meant she could see through from one room to the next, could trace the whole plan at a glance. Kitchen to the left, living area to the right, a short hallway at the back connecting to 2 bedrooms. She could see the rough plumbing stubbed up through the floor in what would be the bathroom. Could see the electrical boxes Earl had mounted to the studs in a few locations before stopping each one positioned correctly at the right height. She walked through the hallway and stood in the doorway of the east-facing bedroom. The window opening was there. Just the rough framing, no glass, but the opening faced east. She looked at it in the darkness and understood that Earl had stood in the same spot and looked at the same opening and thought about morning light falling across a bed that didn't exist yet. In a room that didn't exist yet, for a girl who didn't know any of it was being built. She put her hand on one of the studs. The wood was rough and dense under her palm, the surface weathered, but the interior still tight. A good stud. Earl had always bought good lumber. "You built this," she said to the empty room. "Every weekend. 4 hours down, 4 hours back, and you never said a word." "He said plenty," said a voice behind her. "Just not to you." She turned. A woman stood at the edge of the lot where the trees thinned, holding a flashlight aimed at the ground, a small courtesy, a way of entering someone else's dark without blinding them. She was somewhere in her early 70s with silver hair pulled back in a practical knot and the posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. She wore work boots and a canvas jacket with a tear at the left elbow that had been repaired with iron-on tape. A repair made by someone who understood that functional was more important than perfect. "You're Wren," the woman said. "How do you know my name?" "Because your grandfather talked about you every single weekend for 5 years." She crossed the grass toward the house. "I'm Nettie Greer. I live through those trees quarter-mile east. Earl used to come to my place first thing Saturday morning. I'd make coffee and he'd show me what he was planning to do that weekend." She stopped at the door frame and looked in. "Lord, you look just like Carol." Something tightened behind Wren's ribs. "You knew her." "I knew of her." Earl talked about Carol the way some people talk about something they've lost that they never got over losing, with a kind of reverence. Nettie stepped inside and looked at the framing. He was so proud of this house. He said the third or fourth weekend when the framing was up and he could walk through the rooms for the first time, he said, "Nettie, I've fixed 1,000 things for other people my whole life. This is the first thing I've built for the right reason." Wren looked at the subfloor beneath her feet. "When was the last time he came?" she asked. Nettie thought for a real moment. 6 years ago, give or take a few weeks." She looked at the floor too. "He showed up on a Friday like always, but something was different from the start. He couldn't find his tool belt. Kept asking me the same question about where he'd put the chalk line. I made him sit down and drink some water. After an hour or so, he seemed more himself and he worked most of Saturday. Good work too, his hands knew what they were doing, even when his head was struggling." She paused. "Then Sunday morning he knocked on my door and asked me who I was." The room was very quiet. Dottie had come in through the door frame at some point and was standing just inside listening without interrupting. "I called the number on his emergency contact card," Nettie said. "His nephew, Garrett. He drove down the same day and took Earl home. That was the last time I saw your grandfather on this property." "Garrett took his tools," Wren said. "No." Nettie shook her head, a single decisive movement. "Garrett didn't take anything, because by the time Garrett arrived, the tools weren't here." Wren waited. "Earl brought them to my garage himself," Nettie said. "Saturday night after I'd gone inside. He carried them over in the dark, one box at a time, across the field between this lot and my property. I heard him on the second or third trip and looked out the window. I almost went out to ask what he was doing, but something about the way he was moving, very deliberate, very careful, as if he'd made a decision and was executing it exactly, told me not to interrupt." She looked at Wren steadily. "When he set the last box down on my garage floor, he stood up and said 4 words. He said, 'Hold these for Wren,' and then he went back across the field." Wren turned and walked to the east-facing window opening. She stood there looking out at the darkness and the trees at the edge of the property, and she breathed the cool air coming through the unfinished frame, and she held in her mind the image of an old man carrying his tools through a dark field, box by box, in the last hours of knowing what he knew. 4 words that were really a whole plan. 4 words that had held everything in place for 6 years. She turned back to Nettie. "My mother," she said. "Carol." Nettie's expression shifted. The warmth didn't leave it, but something behind it settled into a different register. Something more careful, more deliberate. She sat down on a stack of lumber inside the room and set her flashlight on the floor, aimed upward, so the light diffused off the unfinished ceiling and lit the space evenly without harshness. "What did they tell you?" she asked. "Garrett told me she left, that she walked out when I was a baby." Wren's voice was even. She'd had 90 minutes in the truck to begin the process of deciding what shape this grief would take, and she'd reached a temporary landing place somewhere between fury and sorrow, a flatter country than either, where she could speak without the words breaking. "He told me she didn't want me." Nettie folded her hands in her lap. "That is not true," she said. "I know, I found it in the journal. Earl wrote that she died." "She did." Nettie looked at Wren directly in the way that people look at you when they're about to say something that can't be unsaid, and they've decided to say it clearly rather than carefully. Carol was a nurse. She worked the night shift at a hospital in Marietta. January. Roads were iced over. She was driving home on Route 7 and she went off the bridge over Harlan Creek around 2 in the morning. She paused. You were 3 years old. You were asleep at home with Earl. The sound of the creek was audible through the window opening. Wren listened to it for a moment. The same creek Earl had written about in the first entry. There's a creek at the back. Carol would have loved it. Earl picked you up the next morning, Nettie said, and told you that Mama had gone on a trip. And then days turned into weeks, Wren said, and weeks into months, and then years. Nettie looked at her hands. He did what he knew how to do. He put you on the bus and he drove. He kept you fed and safe and busy and close. And every year the not saying got heavier, but the telling got harder, not easier. Because you'd built your whole understanding of yourself on the fact that she was somewhere out there. And the truth was so much heavier than the trip she'd gone on. Garrett, Wren said. Garrett came into the picture after the diagnosis. Earl had made him emergency contact 2 years before, back when the first signs started, when Earl was still hoping it was something else. By the time things were clearly going in one direction, Garrett had power of attorney and he was making decisions. Nettie chose her words carefully. I don't know why he told you she left. I've thought about it many times over the years. Maybe he thought it was simpler. Maybe he thought a girl who believed her mother had walked away would stop asking questions. Maybe he just panicked in a parking lot and then never found the nerve to undo it. He panicked, Wren said. That's what it was. She said it without the anger she'd expected to feel. What she felt was something more tired than anger, something that had been carrying itself for a long time and had just set down a part of its load, not the whole thing, but enough to notice the difference. He panicked, and it was easier to let it stand than to fix it. Nettie didn't argue with that. They walked through the house together after that, all three of them. Nettie held the flashlight and pointed it at the features she wanted to name. The rough plumbing stubbed up through the bathroom floor. The electrical boxes Earl had wired to the studs, all positioned correctly at the right height, properly braced. The porch framing along the front of the house, posts and beams all in place, waiting for decking. The kitchen with its one exterior window and its subfloor still solid. He was close, Nettie said, standing in the center of what would be the living room. Another few months of weekends and the shell would have been livable. The finish work was going to take longer. He had a 2-page list. But the hard part, the part most people get wrong, the structure, he finished that. Wren ran her hand along a window header in the kitchen. Earl had doubled it up, 2 2x10s instead of the single one the span would have technically required. She'd heard him explain that reasoning once, you don't build to the minimum. You build to what the thing needs to last. Outside, Nettie led them around the perimeter with the flashlight. The foundation was clean, no cracking, no horizontal movement, the corners still sharp. Everything Earl had touched on this house, he'd touched the right way. Hank Owens called Nettie that night. Wren was sitting on an overturned bucket on the unfinished porch when she heard Nettie's voice through the open front door, low and steady. When Nettie came back out, she said Hank ran the hardware store in town, that he'd sold Earl every board and nail for this house, and had been keeping an eye on the property from a distance since Earl stopped coming. He wants to meet you, Nettie said. Tomorrow, if you're willing. I'm not going anywhere, Wren said. They slept at Nettie's house that night, Wren in the spare room, Dottie on the couch. The spare room had a window facing east. When the light came in before 6 in the morning, Wren was already awake. She dressed in the dark and walked the path through the trees to the lot. The house looked different in the morning. The gray weathered wood of the framing caught the early light differently, the grain visible and detailed. She walked the perimeter again, taking her time, touching things with her hands, the way Earl had taught her, not just looking, but pressing, checking understanding through contact, what you can't fully understand through observation alone. The foundation was solid, the framing was sound, the half-shingled roof had held up through 6 Ohio winters. She went back to Nettie's and found the tools. They were stacked in milk crates along the back wall of the garage. each one wrapped or sleeved or covered in the way that a person wraps tools, who understands what they're worth and plans to use them again. A framing hammer with electrical tape on the handle worn smooth at the grip. A speed square that had been through enough use to wear its markings to near invisibility on some edges. A set of chisels in a canvas roll. A chalk line. Two levels of 4-foot and a 2-foot. A circular saw, its blade clean, its shoe unworn. A collection of drill bits sorted by size in a leather roll. Every tool was clean. Every tool was oiled or waxed or treated with whatever finish it needed. Earl had maintained his tools the way he maintained engines, not as an act of vanity, but as a form of respect for the instrument and for the work it made possible. At the bottom of the last crate, she found the yellow legal pad, 2 pages front and back. Earl's handwriting dense and careful, the way he wrote when something mattered. At the top of the first page, in slightly larger letters, what's left to do. It was a complete project list. Every remaining task on the house numbered and sequenced in the order they needed to happen. Repaper and shingle the north half of the roof. Install exterior sheathing on the back wall. Set windows. Run finish electrical and hook up the service panel. Insulation, then drywall, then tape and mud. Rough plumbing, complete fixtures to install. Porch decking and railing. Interior trim and doors. Paint. He'd written estimated material costs next to each line in pencil. He'd added them up at the bottom, circled the total, and written one word beneath the circle. Enough. She stood in Nettie's garage holding the legal pad and understood that Earl had written this list, knowing he might not be the one to complete it. He'd sequenced the work for someone who understood construction. He'd estimated the costs so whoever came after him would know what they were walking into. He'd done it in the same way he'd done everything else, with preparation and practicality and an absence of self-pity. She carried the tools out of the garage, one crate at a time. Hank Owens arrived mid-morning in a truck with Owens Hardware, Millhaven Est. 1987 painted on the door. He was in his mid-50s, solidly built, with a salt and pepper beard that had grown in the direction it wanted to grow. He shook Wren's hand in the yard and looked at the house for a long moment before saying anything. "Your grandfather bought every piece of lumber that went into this house from my store," he said. "Came in every other Friday like clockwork. I always knew what the weekend was going to hold by what he was loading into his truck." "You knew about the house?" Wren asked. "Watched it go up weekend by weekend. Earl showed me the plans, once hand-drawn on graph paper, every room dimensioned." He looked at the framing. He knew what he was doing. This isn't a first-time builder's house. The bones are right. "I know," Wren said. "I need to finish it." Hank looked at her the way people look at you when they're reassessing what they're dealing with and finding more than they expected. "I can help with that. Materials cost whatever you need. And I've got 2 days a week I can spare to work alongside you if you want the company." "I don't have money yet," Wren said. "The bank account is in my name, but I haven't gotten to a branch." "Earl's credit was good in my store for 20 years, Hank said. "Yours is good too until you tell me otherwise." He delivered the roofing materials himself that afternoon. He helped her unload them and stack them beside the house. Before he left, he stood looking at the structure with his arms crossed and said, "I need someone 2 mornings a week. Counterwork, some delivery runs, inventory. 12 an hour cash. Interested?" "Yes," Wren said without hesitating. "Tuesday and Thursday, 7 sharp." She was on the roof by the time Dottie came to say goodbye. "I need to get back," Dottie called up from the ground. "The lot doesn't run itself." Wren climbed down. They stood in the yard and Dottie looked at the house and then at Wren with the direct, uncomplicated regard she'd had from the beginning. "You're going to be all right," Dottie said. It wasn't a question. "I've got tools, a bank account, and a list," Wren said. Dottie pulled a card from her jacket pocket and held it out. "You need anything, you call. I mean it." She started toward her truck, then stopped. "Don't thank me. Thank your grandfather." Wren watched the truck go down the gravel road and turn onto the county road and disappear. Then she climbed back up to the roof. She worked until the light failed, and she came back at first light the next morning and the morning after that. The rhythm of it settled over her quickly, the way rhythms do when they're the right ones, waking early, walking the path through the trees, reading the structure, before picking up a tool, working from the most critical need outward. She repapered the unfinished roof section, first overlapping the courses, the way Earl had done, the finished half tacking it at close intervals, getting the drip edge set properly before she laid the first course of shingles. The shingles went on one row at a time. Her shoulders ached and her hands blistered, and then the blisters hardened into calluses over the course of a week. She didn't mind the pain. It was the kind that came with progress, the kind where you could look at what hurt and point to the thing the hurting had produced. People started arriving. The first was a man named Warren, who appeared one Wednesday morning in a pickup loaded with 2x4s and a roll of house wrap. She climbed down from the sheathing panel she was cutting. "You Earl Calloway's granddaughter," he called. "I am. Your grandfather drove 3 hours to fix my well pump 12 years ago," he said. "Charged me $40, and I told him it wasn't enough, and he said that's what it was worth." He dropped the tailgate. "I heard you were finishing his house. Where do you want the lumber?" After that, it was every few days. A woman from the neighboring farm brought rolls of fiberglass insulation in the bed of an old Chevy, helped Wren carry them inside, refused to stay for coffee. A retired electrician from the next county over showed up 2 Saturdays in a row and spent both days running wire through the wall cavities, working quietly and precisely. And when she offered to pay him, he said Earl had re-roofed his mother's house the week before she passed and never sent a bill. A couple from town came with a used kitchen sink in good condition, a box of copper fittings, and a covered dish of beef stew that Wren ate for 3 days. Nobody made speeches. Nobody expected gratitude beyond what she offered naturally. They came, did what they could, and left, and the house slowly became more of what it was supposed to be. Nettie watched it happen from her porch with her coffee and a look that said she'd been expecting it. One evening she said, "People don't forget kindness. They just wait for a chance to return it." She said it simply as a statement of observable fact and then went back to her coffee. Wren read Earl's journal every night by flashlight, lying on a sleeping bag on the plywood floor of the east bedroom. Her bedroom, the one with the window that would catch the morning. She read carefully and in sequence now, not searching but receiving, letting the entries come in the order he'd written them. The early ones from when she was small were the ones that stayed with her longest after she closed the cover. Wren took her first steps today, right across the bus floor from the bed to the table. 4 steps. She looked surprised as anything. I think she surprised herself. Fell right on her backside and laughed so hard she couldn't breathe. I picked her up and she grabbed my face with both hands and said something that sounded like Pop. That's me now, I guess. Pop. She read that 3 times. Then she found the entry from when she was 9. Taught Wren how to change a tire this morning. She's 9 years old and she did the whole job in 11 minutes. Better than most adults I've worked with. She tightened the lugs in the right pattern without me showing her star pattern, each one a little, then go around again. She just knew. I asked her how she knew and she said it made sense. I didn't tell her that most people don't figure out what makes sense until they've done something wrong 3 or 4 times first. She's just built that way. Gets it from Carol. Carol always saw how things fit together before anyone else in the room. The entries from the last year before Earl stopped coming were different. The handwriting was the same, but the pressure on the pen was heavier, as if something in him was bracing against what he could feel approaching. He didn't write about it directly. That wasn't how Earl wrote, but it was there in the margins of what he chose to put down. Forgot the chalk line twice today. Left it on the roof the first time. Found it, came back down, set it on the porch, post went back up to work. An hour later, I needed it and couldn't figure out where it was. Nettie found it for me on the porch post without making a thing of it. Good woman. And a few pages later, drove past the turnoff for Wren's school and kept going for about 2 miles before I caught it. I knew the turn. I've made it 500 times. For about 90 seconds, I didn't know it. That's not right. I'm going to call the doctor Monday. She set the journal on her sleeping bag. Outside the window opening, the night was clear and the creek was running. In 4 weeks, the window would have glass in it. In 6 weeks, the walls in this room would have insulation and drywall. In 8 weeks, maybe less, this floor would have something on it besides plywood. She lay back on the sleeping bag and looked at the open ceiling above her at the underside of the roof decking and the rafters Earl had cut and set, and she thought about a man driving 4 hours south every other weekend for 5 years, working 2 days, driving 4 hours back, never saying a word about any of it. She thought about what that required, not just in energy or money or time, but in the discipline of silence. The sustained ability to keep something that large and that meaningful, completely contained, to look at a child who was riding next to you in a bus and asking where you went on weekends, and to say, "I was fixing somebody's roof," and to hold the larger truth steady behind that answer year after year, because you decided that what you were building would eventually speak for itself. Then she thought about Garrett Calloway. She hadn't let herself think about Garrett directly until now. She'd been approaching the fact of him the way you approach something hot, aware of it, giving it appropriate distance, waiting until conditions were right. Lying in the room Earl had framed for her, she allowed herself to think about the parking lot and the ambulance window and the 4 words Earl had managed to say through the closing gap in the door. "I'll come back for you." And then the drive away in Garrett's car, the county services office, the social worker with the kind voice, Garrett in the parking lot delivering his information without ceremony. "Your mother left, Earl took you, nobody else would." Said with the efficiency of someone closing a chapter so he didn't have to open it again. She understood, lying on the sleeping bag, that there were two possibilities. One was that Garrett had lied deliberately. The other was that he'd panicked that a 12-year-old had asked him a question in a parking lot, and he'd reached for the fastest answer available. And the fastest answer had been the wrong one, and then the years had stacked up around it until it was too structural to dismantle without bringing everything else down with it. Both were true in different proportions, she suspected. Most things were. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with that understanding. But she was too tired to carry it tonight, and tomorrow she needed to be up before first light and back on the roof. She closed her eyes. The creek ran steady in the trees behind the house. Wren was already on the porch steps with coffee and the journal when she heard tires on the gravel road the next morning. Not Hank's truck, not Nettie's. This was a different vehicle moving at the careful speed of someone who wasn't sure of the road. A dark blue sedan came around the tree line and stopped in the yard. The man who got out was in his mid-40s, khakis and a polo shirt, thinning hair combed with more care than the effort warranted. He had a briefcase in the posture of someone who spent most of his time indoors. He stood beside the car and looked at the house, at the new shingles on the north half of the roof, at the exterior sheathing she'd installed on the back wall, at the window openings, with their rough frames waiting for glass. Then he looked at Wren on the steps. His mouth went tight. "Hello, Wren," Garrett Calloway said. She stood up slowly. She set her coffee on the step and the journal beside it. She put her hands in her pockets. "Garrett," she said. He looked at the house. "When I heard Earl had a property down here, I thought it was an empty lot." "It wasn't empty," Wren said. "Earl built on it. I can see that." He set the briefcase on the hood of the car. His voice was the voice of someone who had prepared what he was going to say and was following his own script. "With whose money?" "Mine," Wren said. "First Federal Savings, account in my name." Garrett nodded slowly. "I know about the account. I called the bank." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder. "The account was funded during the period when I held power of attorney over Earl's affairs, which means those funds could be considered part of his estate." He held the folder up. "I've filed a motion with the county probate court to freeze the account and review the property deed. My attorney is handling it." Wren looked at him standing in the yard with the briefcase and the polo shirt and the folder. "And the property," she said. "If the deed was recorded during the period of my authority over his affairs, it may be subject to estate review as well." He slid the folder back into the briefcase. "I'm not here to fight with you. I'm here to tell you the legal situation before it becomes more complicated." "What do you want, Garrett?" He closed the briefcase. He looked at the house one more time and then at her. "I want what's fair," he said. "Earl was my uncle. I managed his affairs for the last 18 months of his life. I handled the paperwork, the facility arrangements, the estate. That's more than anyone else did." You didn't call me when he died, Wren said. I found out from a forwarded letter. Garrett's jaw flexed. He didn't answer that. I'd stop putting money into a house you might not own in 60 days, he said. He got back in the car. He rolled down the window. You were always a smart kid, Wren. Smart enough to know when to be careful. The sedan backed down the gravel road, turned onto the county road. The sound of the engine faded. The dust from the tires settled slowly in the morning air. Wren stood in the yard in front of the house Earl had built with his hands and his weekends and his silence, and she waited until the dust was fully settled and the morning was quiet again. Then she went inside and picked up the screw gun and went back to work. Nettie came through the trees the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, moving faster than Wren had seen her move. She was carrying a manila envelope pressed flat against her chest with one arm, her flashlight in the other hand, even though it was light enough not to need it. Wren was on the porch steps with coffee and the legal pad going over the remaining items on Earl's list. Nettie sat down on the step beside her without preamble. Hank called me last night, she said, after you went to sleep. She set the envelope on her knee. Garrett stopped at the hardware store on his way out of town yesterday. Asked Hank where the county clerk's office was. Hank figured out why. She looked at Wren. I should have given you this the first night you were here. I kept waiting for the right moment. There isn't one, Wren said. No. Nettie opened the envelope and drew out 3 documents, spreading them carefully on the step between them. Earl brought these to me the same weekend he brought the tools. The same night, actually, he came back a second time after I'd gone inside. He sat at my kitchen table and laid these out one by one and explained each one to me. Then he put them back in the envelope and said, if Garrett comes after her, money, show them this. In that order. Wren looked at the documents on the step. The first was a letter on bank stationery from First Federal Savings, notarized, dated 11 years ago. It confirmed the opening of a custodial savings account under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. The depositor was listed as Earl James Calloway. The beneficiary was Wren Ann Calloway. The account type UTMA was printed clearly at the top of the page above the notary stamp. A custodial account under UTMA, Nettie said, means the money belongs to the minor from the moment it's deposited. Not to the depositor, not to his estate. It's a completed gift. Earl wasn't holding it for you. It was already yours the day he put the first dollar in. Garrett said the account was funded during his power of attorney, Wren said. Some of it was, but the account type doesn't change based on when the deposits were made. It was a UTMA account from the day it was opened. Nettie pointed to the date on the letter. 11 years ago. Garrett's power of attorney was filed 9 years ago. The account predates his authority by 2 years, and its legal structure is independent of anything that came after. Wren picked up the letter and read it through. The second document was a certified copy of the property deed for the Millhaven lot. Wren had seen the original from the metal box, but this copy had something the original didn't. A county recorder's stamp in the upper right corner with a date printed beside it in the clear block type that county offices use for official records. Look at the recording date, Nettie said. Wren looked. The deed had been recorded at the county clerk's office 12 years ago. Garrett's power of attorney had been filed 9 years ago, 3 years earlier. Earl had put the land in her name 3 years before Garrett had any legal authority over anything. Power of attorney is prospective, Nettie said. It gives authority over decisions made after it's granted. It can't reach backward and claim assets that were already transferred. The land was in your name before Garrett existed in any legal capacity related to Earl's affairs. She paused. His attorney is going to tell him the same thing if the man is worth his fee. Wren set the deed down and picked up the third document. It was a handwritten letter, 2 pages on lined paper, the handwriting steady and deliberate. Earl, at his most careful, pressing the pen firmly into the page, the way he did when he was writing something that needed to last. Nettie, I know what's coming. My mind is going, and there isn't much I can do about that now. But there are things I can do while I still can, and I'm doing them. Garrett will come for everything. He always has when he thought something was available. I love him because he's family and because he's frightened and because frightened people deserve patience, but I do not trust him with what belongs to Ren. The bank account is hers. It has been since the day I opened it. The UTMA structure was intentional. I asked the banker specifically about how to make the transfer permanent and irreversible. He told me the UTMA was the right instrument, and I used it. The money cannot be reclaimed by my estate because it was never mine to reclaim. The land is hers. It has been since the day the deed was recorded. I put it in her name before any of this other business started specifically so that no arrangement made later could touch it. The recording date is on the deed. The dates are on my side. If Ren finds the bus, she'll find the box. If she finds the box, she'll find her way here. If Garrett comes after her when she does show him these papers, show them to his lawyer. The lawyer will understand what they mean. I built the legal wall before I lost the ability to build anything else. That was the last clear thing I could do for her, and I did it. Hold on to her tools, Nettie. She's going to need them. Earl Wren read the letter twice. She sat on the porch step of the house her grandfather had framed and held a letter he'd written in his last clear hours, and she understood that the house and the tools and the bank account and the deed were not four separate things. They were one thing, a single structure built over 18 years from $50 deposits and weekend drives and careful signatures on documents filed in the right order at the right times. He'd built it the way he built everything, with attention to sequence, with respect for what came first, with the understanding that the foundation had to be right before anything else could stand on it. He had known Garrett would come. He had known before Garrett knew himself. She set the letter down and picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. "What do I do with these?" she asked. "You wait," Nettie said. Garrett filed a motion. "There'll be a hearing. When there is, you bring these and you let the date speak." She paused. His attorney will likely advise him to withdraw before it gets that far. But if it does get that far, these are enough. Wren looked at the three documents arranged on the step. "He planned for this," she said. "He planned for everything he could still plan for," Nettie said. "There were things he couldn't plan for, things he couldn't fix." She stood up and looked at the house. But the things he could reach, he reached them. Wren kept working. That was the answer she had for most things. The days had their rhythm now, and the rhythm held her when other things threatened to pull loose. Up before light coffee, the path through the trees read the structure before picking up a tool. She was finishing the drywall room by room, measuring each sheet by hand and cutting it with a utility knife and a straight edge the way Earl had taught her, snapping the sheet along the scored line rather than cutting all the way through. It was slower than some people worked, but the joints were tight and the fit was clean. The retired electrician came back the following Saturday to install the outlets and light fixtures, working his way through each room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this for 40 years. By noon, the lights in the kitchen and living room worked. He flipped the switch in the east bedroom last and looked at the ceiling fixture, come on a simple bare bulb in a porcelain socket, and said Earl would be satisfied with that, and packed up his tools and left. The woman from town who'd brought the curtains came back with a friend, and the two of them spent an afternoon spackling the nail holes and dings in the drywall Wren had hung. When they left, the walls were ready for primer. Hank brought paint on a Tuesday. 2 colors, a warm white for the interior and for the exterior, a yellow that he set on the porch without comment and waited for Wren's reaction. She looked at it for a moment. It was the same yellow as the bus. Not exactly paint was paint, and the bus had been a specific industrial shade, but close enough that standing in the yard and looking at the sample Hank had brushed on a piece of trim board, she felt the connection immediately and completely. "Is that intentional?" she asked. "Earl told me once what color he wanted to paint it," Hank said. "Showed me a photo of the bus. Said same as that, as close as you can get." He shrugged. "I matched it as best I could." She started painting the following morning. The interior went first room by room, a coat of primer, and then 2 coats of the warm white, working in the order that made sense: ceilings first, then walls, then trim. She'd never painted a house before, but she understood the logic of the sequencing, and she understood how to read a surface before you put anything on it. The brushwork at the edges took longer to learn than the rolling, but by the second room, she had the feel of it. Nettie came by each evening with dinner. They ate on the porch on overturned buckets and talked about the house, what it was becoming, what still needed doing. Nettie had opinions about things Wren hadn't asked about, delivered with a directness that Wren appreciated. Wren took most of the suggestions. The ones she didn't take, Nettie accepted without argument. Neither of them talked about Garrett. Neither of them talked about the hearing. There was nothing to say about it that the three documents hadn't already said. 26 days after she'd arrived in Mill Haven, Wren finished painting the exterior. She stood in the yard in the late afternoon light and looked at the house. The yellow was right. It was the right shade for this house, on this piece of land at the edge of these trees with the creek running behind it and the October sky above it going blue toward dark. The trim was white, the door was white, the porch railing was white. The windows had glass. Now Hank had helped her set them, two people, in a careful sequence of shimming and nailing and checking for square. The porch had its decking and its railing, the boards laid with consistent spacing. She knocked on the door frame the way she'd knocked on the drywall 3 weeks ago, and the house returned the solid, settled sound of something that was finished and knew it. She went inside. She stood in the living room and looked at what Earl had planned and she had completed. The warm white walls, the trim work she'd cut and nailed and caulked and painted, the kitchen with its sink installed and its faucet running hot and cold, the bathroom with its toilet and its shower, the hallway leading to the 2 bedrooms, and her bedroom. She stood in the doorway of the east bedroom and looked at the curtains. Nettie had made a dark blue flannel cut from fabric Wren had chosen specifically because it was close to the color of the curtains on the bus. They hung in the window frame that Earl had built so that the morning light would come through it and fall across the bed at a particular angle. She'd put a bed in the room, a simple platform frame she'd built from pine boards with a mattress Hank had found at an estate sale. When the morning light came through the curtains, the first time she'd stood in the doorway for a long time and not moved. It was the light from the bus, the same quality of it, the same warmth and angle of a morning she'd grown up inside, coming through flannel curtains, falling across the space where she was supposed to sleep. Earl had done that on purpose. He'd oriented the window to reproduce that specific morning. He'd planned it when she was 6 years old, and he'd built it when she was 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. 4 hours of driving each way, 2 days of work each weekend, and the whole time the window was going in. He'd been thinking about a particular light that a particular girl had always woken up to, and he'd wanted to give it to her in a form that had walls around it. She sat on the edge of the bed. She picked up the metal box from the floor where she'd kept it every night, and she took out the white envelope. She'd looked at it every night. She'd picked it up and turned it over and set it down again. She told herself she was waiting for the house to be finished. And that was true, but it was also true that she'd been afraid of it in the way you're afraid of the last chapter of something you know is going to end. The house was finished. She slid her thumb under the sealed flap and opened it. Inside were 2 things, a folded letter on lined paper, and something small and flat that she felt before she saw it, a photograph wallet-sized with a slight curve to it from years of being inside the envelope. She unfolded the letter first. The handwriting was Earl's from the early years before the tremor, before the compression of effort that appeared in the later pages of the journal. Steady and small and deliberate the way he wrote when something mattered most. Wren, if you're reading this, you found the bus and you found the box. I knew you would. You were always the kind of person who shows up. I want to tell you about this house. I started building it because I wanted to give you something that couldn't move. You and I have lived a good life on that bus, and I wouldn't trade those years for anything on earth. But a bus is a place you pass through. A house is a place you come back to. I wanted you to have somewhere to come back to no matter what happened, no matter where you went or how long you were gone. The money in the bank is yours, every dollar. I saved it from the work I did on the road, a little at a time over many years. It isn't a fortune, but it's enough to get started, and getting started is the hardest part. The deed is yours too. I put everything in your name the day I bought it, before any of this other business started, because I wanted it to be yours in a way that nobody could question and nobody could take. Not Garrett, not the state, not anyone. There's something I need to tell you, and I'm sorry it's in a letter instead of in words. Your mother didn't leave you. Carol didn't walk away. She died in a car accident on an icy road in January driving home from her shift at the hospital. She was a nurse. She worked nights. She was careful, and she was good at her job, and she was coming home to you when it happened. She was always coming home to you. I should have told you that when you were old enough to hear it. I looked for the right moment for years, and I could never find it because every time I looked at your face, I couldn't be the one who put that weight on you. You were so young, and then you weren't as young, and by then the not telling had been going on so long that undoing it felt like pulling a wall out of a house that was already standing. I was afraid of what would fall. That was my failure, not yours. I want you to know that clearly. The not knowing was my doing, not a kindness to you. Carol would have loved this house. She always wanted somewhere with trees and a creek and room to breathe. She used to talk about it at night after you were asleep, somewhere green, she'd say, with room for a child to run. I thought about that every weekend I came down here. Every board I put up, I was thinking about what she would have wanted the place to be. A home isn't where you park Ren. It's where someone built something just for you. This is mine for you. I love you, Bird. Pop. She set the letter on the bed beside her. Her hands were not steady. She didn't try to make them steady. She picked up the photograph. It was small wallet-sized, the edges slightly soft from years inside an envelope. The image was clear. A young woman sitting on a porch step, a different porch than this one, an older one with peeling paint and a geranium in a pot to the left with a baby in her lap. The woman was in her mid-20s, dark hair pulled back loosely, a face that was open and alive and in the middle of laughing at something not posed, not arranged. The laugh caught mid-moment the way the best photographs catch things. The baby in her lap was small, round-faced, maybe 6 months old, both arms reaching upward, one hand grabbing for the woman's chin. Both of them were laughing. On the back in ink faded to a warm brown Carol and Wren first summer. Wren looked at her mother's face for a long time. She looked at the smile. She looked at the arms around the baby. She looked at the quality of the laugh, wide and unguarded, and directed entirely at the small person in her lap, the complete attention of someone who had found something that held all of it, all their capacity for joy in a single place. She looked at her own face, small and round and reaching. She unclasped the brass locket from around her neck. The locket was warm from her skin. She turned it over in her palm, worn smooth on the back, where her hand had touched it for 18 years. She'd opened it 1,000 times over 18 years and found it empty every time. And she'd kept wearing it because Earl had given it to her, and because an empty locket felt like a promise of something that might still be filled. She folded the photograph carefully, finding the fold that the paper wanted to make the one that preserved the image without creasing it through the faces. She fitted inside the locket. It was a tight fit. The photograph was almost exactly the size of the interior, as if someone had known the dimensions when they chose the photograph, or as if some things just work out to the right size in the end. The locket closed. She put it back on. She sat on the edge of the bed in the east bedroom of the finished house and pressed her palm flat against her chest where the locket lay, and she let herself feel the full weight of everything the day had put down in front of her. The letter, the photograph, the face of a woman who had been driving home, the word her grandfather had used at the end of every letter and every bedtime and every morning on the bus since she was 4 years old. Bird. She let herself cry. Not quietly, not carefully. She let it be what it was, big and unmanaged and long overdue, the kind of crying that has been waiting for a room to happen in for 4 walls and a roof and somewhere to put it all down. She sat in the room Earl had framed for her and cried for her mother and for Earl, and for the 6 years she'd spent carrying a story that wasn't true, and for the 12-year-old standing in a parking lot who'd asked an uncle a question and gotten an answer that had shaped everything that came after. When she was done, she dried her face on her sleeve. She put the letter back in the envelope. She set the envelope on the shelf she'd built into the east wall of the bedroom, a simple pine shelf mounted level where she'd put the journal, in the bank book, in the deed, in the metal box. The shelf held all of it without complaint. She'd built it from good pine-mounted level with the right fasteners in the right studs, the way Earl had taught her to build everything. She went out to the porch and sat on the step and looked at the yard and the tree line and the strip of sky above the ridge where the stars were coming out. The creek ran in the trees behind the house. That sound had been there from the first night, constant and unchanged, and she'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that's always present. And now, sitting on the finished porch of the finished house, she let herself notice it again. Earl had written about it in the first journal entry. There's a creek at the back. Carol would have loved it. 3 weeks passed. She worked at Hank's store on Tuesdays and Thursdays and came home and fixed things for people who needed things fixed. Word had moved through Millhaven and the surrounding area in the particular way that word moves in small rural places, not quickly or loudly, but thoroughly through the interlocked network of people who know each other's businesses because they've been in proximity long enough. Earl Calloway's granddaughter was living in the house he'd built on Plum Creek Road. She was handy. She charged less than the work was worth, which made some people uncomfortable and others grateful. A man from 2 roads over brought a riding mower with a seized engine. She rebuilt the carburetor in Nettie's garage and had it running in under 2 hours. He tried to pay her $80, and she told him $50, and he said that wasn't enough, and she said that's what it was. A retired teacher came to the door one afternoon with a kitchen faucet in a plastic bag. Hank at the hardware store had told her Wren could help. The cartridge was corroded, a 20-minute job. When the teacher reached for her wallet, Wren said no. "You can't just fix people's things for free," the teacher said. "My grandfather did it his whole life," Wren said. She packed up her tools. He said the work was the payment. The teacher stood in her kitchen with good water pressure for the first time in 2 years and shook her head slowly. "Nettie keeps saying you're just like him." She paused. "I think Nettie's right." On a Tuesday morning in late October, she was at Hank's store opening the front counter when she heard a car on the road outside. She recognized the engine before she saw the car. She'd been listening to engines all her life, and a sound once learned stays learned. She looked through the store window and saw the dark blue sedan pull to the curb. Garrett got out. He looked different than he had in the yard 3 weeks ago. Thinner, or maybe just less assembled. The khakis and the polo shirt were there, but something about the way he was wearing them had shifted, as if the clothing had been pressed for a person who no longer quite filled it the same way. He had nothing in his hands, no briefcase. He stood on the sidewalk outside the store and looked at the door for a moment before coming in. Hank was in the back. Wren was alone at the counter. "I'm not here about the legal matter," Garrett said before she could speak. She waited. He came to the counter and stopped. He looked at the surface of it, the worn wood, the old glass display case underneath the jar of pens Hank kept by the register, and then he looked at her. "I withdrew the motion," he said. "Last week, my attorney explained the UTMA structure to me and the recording date on the deed, and He stopped. "I withdrew it." "I know," Wren said. "Nettie told me." He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. "I drove down because there's something I need to do that I can't do through an attorney or a phone call." She said nothing. "When I told you that your mother left," Garrett said, and his voice shifted register in the middle of the sentence, something in it loosening that had been held tight before. "I was standing in a parking lot with a 12-year-old asking me what was going to happen, and I panicked. I said the first thing that came out, something simple, something final, something that didn't require me to explain a grief I didn't know how to explain in a parking lot next to an ambulance." He looked at the counter. "And then I drove away, and I told myself it was better that way, less complicated. And every year it got easier to not fix it, because fixing it would have required me to admit that I'd done it in the first place." Wren kept her face even. She'd had 3 weeks with this information, and she knew the shape of it, now knew where its edges were, knew which parts of it were anger and which parts were grief, and which parts were something closer to pity. "She was coming home," Wren said. "My mother. She worked a night shift, and she was driving home on an icy road, and she went off a bridge. She was a nurse. She had my name written on a blanket before I was born. She wrote me a birthday card for my first birthday." She paused. I spent 6 years thinking she looked at me and chose to leave. That's what 6 years of that feels like, Garrett. In case you were wondering, he didn't flinch from it. She'd expected him to, and he didn't. He stood there and took it, and she gave him some credit for that. I know, he said. I know what it feels like because I watched you carry it. Every time I saw you in those first years, it was on your face. And I told myself it was better than the alternative. And that was a lie I told myself because the alternative required something from me I wasn't prepared to give. He looked up. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not sure that's mine to ask for. I just needed to say it to your face. Wren looked at him across the counter for a long moment. She thought about the journal entry she'd read 2 weeks ago in the east bedroom by flashlight, an entry Earl had written when she was 9 years old. Garrett came by again today, third time asking for help this year. I gave him $200 I don't really have because he's family, and that's what you do. I worry about that boy. He's always been afraid of not having enough, afraid of being left behind, afraid of losing. Fear like that doesn't protect you from the thing you're afraid of. It just makes you take from the people nearest to you. He's not a bad man. He's just a frightened one. And I don't know how to fix that kind of thing. Some things you can't fix from the outside. She closed the journal after that entry and sat with it for a long time. I know why you did it, she said. Garrett looked at her. Earl wrote about you, she said. In the journal. He understood you better than you probably wanted him to. He still gave you the $200 every time you came around because that's who he was. She paused. He wasn't a bad man either, Garrett, and neither probably are you. She watched something move across his face that she didn't try to name. He loved you, she said. He wrote about it. He worried about you. He thought you were frightened, not cruel, and he was probably right. Garrett pressed his hands flat on the counter and looked at them. He was right, he said. I have been. My whole life. He straightened up. He looked like a man who had come prepared to receive something difficult and was now having to reckon with something he hadn't prepared for, which was harder. I don't know how to do anything about that. I don't know either, Wren said. That's not mine to figure out. He nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, not a business card, just a piece of notepaper with a phone number written on it. He set it on the counter. I have some of your mother's things, he said. I've had them since Earl went into the facility. I kept them because I kept everything. I'm working on being different about that. He looked at the number on the paper. If you want them, call me. I'll bring them to you or I'll ship them, whatever you'd rather. There's no obligation either way. He left the card on the counter and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it. He talked about you, Garrett said. Earl, at the facility in the last months when he was mostly somewhere else, he'd have these moments of clarity. And in those moments, it was always your name. Always Wren. He pushed the door open. I don't think he stopped waiting for you to show up. Right up to the end. The door closed behind him. Wren stood at the counter and looked at the card for a moment. Then she picked it up and put it in her pocket. She called him that evening from the porch of the yellow house, with the creek running below the tree line and the October sky going dark above the ridge. The conversation was brief and practical. He said he'd come down that weekend. She said that was fine. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a smaller car, the one with a dented front fender and the older engine, the car of someone who'd stopped performing a prosperity they didn't have. He was alone. No briefcase. He came up the gravel drive slowly and parked in the yard and got out with a cardboard box that he carried in both arms. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the house. The yellow paint, the white trim, the porch with its railing, the east-facing window catching the afternoon light. He stood there for a long moment, and she let him stand there. He'd be proud, Garrett said. His voice was quieter than she'd heard it before. Earl, he'd be so proud of this that he wouldn't know what to do with himself. I know, Wren said. She came down the porch steps and took the box from him. It was lighter than she expected. The word Carol was written on the side in faded marker. Everything in there is hers, Garrett said. I went through it before I came. I wanted to make sure. He stepped back. There's a birthday card at the bottom. She wrote it for your first birthday and addressed it to you. She died before she could. He stopped. Tried again. She didn't get to give it to you. Wren held the box. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He looked at the house one more time. Then he got back in the car and pulled slowly down the gravel road, and she watched him go until the sound of the engine was gone. She sat on the porch steps and opened the box. Carol's things. A thin gold necklace with a pendant in the shape of a star. The chain slightly tangled the pendant warm in her palm when she lifted it out. A stack of photographs held with a rubber band. Carol at a holiday dinner paper crown on her head, mid-laugh, reaching across the table for something off camera. Carol in nursing scrubs leaning against a hospital vending machine, making a face that suggested the machine had done something to deserve it. Carol standing in front of a small house with a woman who might have been her mother, both of them squinting in summer light. Carol in a hospital bed, tired and luminous, the way new mothers are holding a wrapped bundle against her chest, with both arms looking down at it with an expression that was not performance or pose, but simply the unguarded face of someone who had just understood something large for the first time. Wren held that last photograph up to the fading afternoon light, her mother's arms around her, her own face, brand new, unfocused, turned toward the warmth. At the bottom of the box, a pink envelope. On the front, in steady handwriting, to Wren on your first birthday. She opened it. The card inside had a simple illustration on the front, a small bird on a branch. She opened the card and read her mother's handwriting for the first time. Happy birthday, sweet girl. You are 1 year old today, and you have already changed everything about my life that needed changing. I didn't know it was possible to love someone this immediately or this completely. I didn't know it could happen like this. Wherever you go, whatever you do, whatever happens in the years between now and whenever you read this, I need you to know one thing clearly. You were wanted. From the very first moment. From before the first moment. You were wanted in a way that I don't have words big enough for, so I'm using the small ones instead. Wanted. Expected. Already loved before you arrived. Happy birthday, Wren. Love, Mama. She sat on the porch of the yellow house and let herself cry again, but differently this time. Not the big unmanaged grief of the week before the weight of lost years and a false story finally set down. This was something quieter. Something that came from fullness rather than from emptiness. She cried because she was wanted. Because she had been wanted from before the first moment. Because a woman driving home on an icy road in January had a card in her house already addressed to a 1-year-old who wasn't one yet, and that card had waited 23 years to find the right hands, and it had finally arrived. When she was done, she dried her face and sat quietly for a while. The creek ran in the trees. A bird crossed the last of the light above the ridge. The stars were beginning in the eastern sky. The first ones that appeared before the sky was fully dark, the ones that came out early as if they couldn't wait. She went inside and put Carol's things on the shelf in the east bedroom. The photographs, the necklace, the birthday card in its pink envelope next to the journal, and the bank book, and the deed and Earl's letter in the metal box. The shelf held all of it without complaint. She'd built it from good pine-mounted level, with the right fasteners in the right studs, the way Earl had taught her to build everything. A month after the yellow house was finished, the bus arrived. Dottie arranged the tow herself, called a man she knew with a flatbed, refused to discuss cost, and called it a debt settled on both sides. The bus came down Plum Creek Road on a gray November morning, and Wren directed the driver to the far side of the yard, off to the right of the house, where the ground was level and the oaks offered some shelter from the weather. They unloaded it carefully, setting it down in the grass with its nose pointed toward the road. It sat in the yard the way old things sit when they've come to the right place after a long time, with a kind of permanence as if the ground had been waiting for something this particular size and weight and had been patient about it. Wren walked down to it. She opened the door with the key she'd kept in her pocket since the storage lot. The hinge made its complaint, the same one it had always made, the bottom one on the driver's side that Earl had been meaning to spray with WD-40 for as long as she could remember. She climbed the 3 steps and stood in the aisle and breathed. Vinyl and motor oil. And underneath that quality, she'd never been able to name the accumulated presence of a particular life lived in a particular space over many years. She went to the driver's seat and sat down. The vinyl was split, the foam showing through. The leather on the steering wheel was peeling. The seat creaked when she sat in it, the same spring, the same place. Through the dusty windshield, she could see the yard and the yellow house and the oak trees beyond it, in the strip of sky above the ridge where the clouds were moving. The house looked right from here. It looked like something that belonged where it was, that had always been going to be here, that was simply finishing an arrival that had started a long time ago. She put her hands on the wheel. She was 8 years old, sitting on Earl's lap on a dirt road in Tennessee, his hands over hers, the road ahead of them, straight and running into the distance. His voice in her ear unhurried the voice he used when he was teaching her something that mattered. Steady now. You've got it. She sat with her hands on the wheel for a while and let the memory be what it was. She didn't try to hold it too tightly, because memory held too tightly turns into something else, turns into grief or longing or the particular ache of wanting to go back. She held it the way you hold something you love firmly enough that it knows it's being held loosely enough that it can still be what it is. Then she climbed down, walked back to the house, went up the porch steps, and sat on the top step with the journal in her lap. The evening was cool, and the light was doing what October light does in Ohio when the clouds move the right way, going golden and low across the yard, touching the side of the house and the side of the bus, making both of them glow in that particular way that only lasts a few minutes before the day is done. She looked at the two things standing side by side in the yard. The bus faded and settled, wearing the stripe of blue tape on its mirror that she'd put there at age 7 because she thought it looked fast, and Earl had let it stay without comment, which was its own kind of endorsement. Flat tires, weather-worn paint, all the miles it had traveled to all the small places where someone needed something fixed. Her whole childhood in 40 feet of yellow metal. The house painted the same yellow with glass in every window and light inside, and a shelf in the east bedroom crowded with everything Earl had left her and everything Carol had left her and everything she'd added herself in the months since she'd walked across a storage lot in Dayton with a garbage bag and $41 and a letter on county letterhead. One was where she had survived. The other was where she was meant to stay. She opened the journal to the last entry Earl had written, the one near the back of the book. The handwriting compressed and pressed hard into the page, the last few lines slightly uneven. In a way, the rest was not the hand that had written them already beginning to struggle with what the mind still wanted to say. I don't know if she'll come. I believe she will, because she has always been the kind of person who shows up. I built the best thing I could build with the time and the hands and the mind I had. Whatever is left when I'm gone, the house, the money, the tools, the land, it's all hers. It was always hers. I was just holding it until she was ready. I'll come back for you, Bird. I know I said that. I mean it differently now than I did then. I mean it this way. Everything I could carry of myself, I left somewhere you could find it. The bus, the box, the house, the letters, the money. Every Saturday, drive down and Sunday drive back. Every board I cut and every nail I drove and every measurement I checked twice because it had to be right. That's me coming back. That's how I kept my word. She closed the journal. The evening light finished what it was doing and faded, and the yard went to the blue-gray of dusk, and the creek ran on in the trees behind the house, and the first lights came on through the windows. She'd left the kitchen light on when she came outside, and the yellow walls held the light and gave it back to the yard in a warm, steady glow. She pressed her palm against her chest where the locket lay warm, closed no longer empty. She had $41 in a garbage bag when she arrived. She had a foundation now.